Sweet, thank you. I'll go ahead and say this in English and then I'll repeat it in Spanish. So, hi everyone, my name is Jasmine. I'm here on behalf of the CLC. What we practice is something called language justice, and this really just means that we like to create spaces in which folks can participate in the language of their heart or the language that they feel most comfortable in. In order to do this, we're going to be activating the simultaneous interpretation function. As soon as we do this, and that'll be after we finish this introduction, you'll see a globe at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. Once we do that, if you are not fully bilingual in English and Spanish or in English and Nepali, in this case, we ask that you please select your preferred language at the bottom of the screen. I also ask that y'all please keep in mind your pace and your clarity. Just take your time with your words. And if you have any issues with the interpretation, you can always send us a message in the chat and we'll be happy to help that way. I'll repeat this in Spanish now. Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Yasmín. Estoy aquí de parte de la CLC. Lo que nosotros practicamos es algo que llamamos justicia del lenguaje. Esto significa que queremos crear espacios en los que todos puedan participar en el idioma de su corazón o en el idioma en el que se sientan más cómodos. Para hacer esto, vamos a activar la función de interpretación simultánea. En un momento van a poder ver un globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla que dice interpretación. Ahí, si no son completamente bilingües en inglés y en español, por favor elijan su idioma preferido. También les pido que tengan en mente su velocidad y su claridad. Tomen su tiempo con sus palabras y cualquier cosa que se les ofrezca nos pueden mandar un mensaje por el chat. Okay, thank you so much, and I'll pass it on to you, Pratima.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'm going to start off by introducing myself in English first. Hi, my name is Pratima. I'm the Nepali interpreter from CLC, Colorado Language Connection. It's an honor to be here because our motto is to fill the gap and bridge the gap between bilinguals. And I'm here to fill in with the interpretation. I'm going to translate in Nepali now. Namaste सबैजनालाई, मेरो नाम प्रतिमा हो. आज यहाँ उपस्थित हुनुभएका र नहुनुभएका सबै महानुभावमा मेरो सद्भाव र आदर छ. आज हामीहरू यहाँ कुरा गर्दैछौँ हाम्रो घरबार विहीनताको बारेमा. त्यसको विस्तृत जानकारी अब हामी यहाँ माझ इन्टरप्रेट गर्दै प्रस्तुत गर्नेछौँ. यहाँको केही सल्लाह सुझाव भएमा कृपया राख्नुहोला. हामी अवश्य पनि उत्तर दिनेछौँ. उपस्थित हुनुभएका नहुनुभएकाहरूसम्म कुरा पुर्याउने आज हाम्रो अठोट रहेको छ. आशा छ यहाँहरूले बुझ्नुहुनेछ. कुनै शब्दहरू बुझ्नु भएन अथवा कुनै वाक्यहरू बुझ्नु भएन भने कृपया हामीलाई सम्पर्क गर्नु पनि सक्नुहुनेछ. धन्यवाद. Thank you.
Okay, I just set the interpretation. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight. I'm Eliza with Denver Urban Gardens, and we have our friends from Urban Peak here with us tonight. This is part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having with our community gardeners and our greater community around the intersections of our community garden spaces. Oops, so sorry, Jasmine, I'll get you assigned as an interpreter. Technical difficulties. And we're hoping that this will just be more information for everybody in how we show up for each other as a community and how we meet people where they're at in the context in which we live. I am going to, let's see, Jasmine, I want to make sure you're able to interpret. So I will just turn it over to Nico. We have Nico from Urban Peak. Urban Peak is a Denver-based nonprofit that supports youth experiencing homelessness. And Nico has a lot of really rich and awesome info to share with us. So take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So once again, my name is Nico. I am with Urban Peak here in Denver, working with youth who are experiencing homelessness. I have actually been working at Urban Peak for 8 years. I started out doing street outreach, and I can explain more about what that is. Helped to oversee our day center for a long time, And currently I'm a training manager, so I'm in charge of onboarding our staff. And a lot of the information you're going to get tonight is actually some of the same stuff that we would teach our staff when they first come into work at our agency, because so much of the work that we do is so specific, and homelessness in Denver is so specific that it's information that a lot of people don't have even when they enter into this field. So I'm really excited to share some of this with y'all, and I'll have my email at the end. So you are free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions that you have about anything I shared tonight. And the PDF of this PowerPoint is more than welcome to get spread out. So folks from Denver Urban Gardens can pass that along. I also want to name that I activated the closed captioning on my screen sharing on my PowerPoint. It's not always 100% accurate, but just in case you're hard of hearing, wanted to make sure that was activated as well. So might not always be accurate, but it is on there. And I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. We're just gonna get rolling. So I think we're gonna get rolling. All right. So the training intentions for tonight, we have about 2 hours together. I was sharing earlier before we started, I'm like, I'm gonna try really hard to give us a break, but if we're not getting through this info fast enough, it might not happen. So we'll see. It'll be a fun surprise halfway through. And we are going to do just an introduction to homelessness in Denver. And really, when I say introduction, it is like, it's an introduction. We could go so much deeper into so many things, but wanted to just give like kind of an explanation of what things look like right now. We'll do a really brief introduction to trauma, some considerations around boundaries, and then just a quick introduction to some de-escalation strategies and like how to engage with someone who's unhoused. And so I think those last two topic areas are
Estos últimos dos temas nos van a dar información muy práctica sobre
experiencing homelessness and sort of what our interactions look like with those folks in different spaces and how we can show up well. So with that, I also wanted to quickly give a little overview of Urban Peak and our programs, just in case you aren't familiar with us. If you ever run into someone who's between 15 and 24 years old and is experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, we have a whole range of services, from street outreach, where we work on just meeting people where they're at, giving them really basic resources. That's what I started out doing. So going to bus stations and parks and libraries and just meeting people who might not know about services. And it's just a really relationship building focused job where we're maybe handing out like socks and granola bars and resources, and also just getting to know people and referring them to our other programs. And so we also have a daytime drop-in center with like showers and laundry and 3 meals a day. We have an emergency shelter where people can stay overnight. And then we have several housing programs. And then our support services program is the department that works with folks on education and employment goals. So we have all of that within Urban Peak. It really helps for people to bounce between programs because it's really streamlined since it's all under the same organization. So anyone who's young and is experiencing homelessness, we would love to work with them. So in case you ever come across someone in one of those situations, just wanted to let you know that we exist. And our main drop-in center is right downtown at like basically the intersection of Broadway and Stout, and you can find our address and our phone number online. Just a little quick Google search. Just wanted to give you a little bit about my context and kind of the lens that I use to approach this work. So with that, we're going to hop into an introduction to homelessness. And I'm really intentionally being a little bit broader and not focusing in specific on youth, since youth are not the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness in our city. But if you do want to learn more about youth specifically, once again, just let me know. I have some info on that I would love to share. So I wanted to start with something that's a little bit in the weeds because I think it's important. We have branch of the federal government, or like subset of the federal government, HUD, the Office of Housing and Urban Development. They have a very specific definition for what literal homelessness is. And this is sleeping in a place that's not meant for human habitation. And there are some things that are considered homeless according to the government, like staying in a shelter, if you're sleeping on the streets in a tent, anything like that, if you're staying in your car. If you are in a hotel or motel that's paid for by an organization, you're considered homeless. Actually, certain types of transitional housing, you're still considered homeless, which was like really surprising when I learned that, but it's because it's really meant to be short-term housing, so you easily could re-enter the streets. And then in Denver, we have really specific programs like the tiny home villages and the safe outdoor spaces that are run in Denver specifically for people experiencing homelessness. And those are also both forms of literal homelessness. What's important to name here is like that is the narrow definition with everything else we talk about. Like that's the definition the government uses to define homelessness. What's really important is there's a lot of things that aren't captured here. So when we're looking at numbers about who's experiencing homelessness, there's a lot that it doesn't show up. So things like couch surfing, especially for youth, this is really big. People who maybe are in between places and are crashing on someone's couch. It could be a different couch every night. If you have a roof over your head, even if it's not guaranteed the next night, that's not considered literally homeless. If you're a family and you're doubled up with another family, like you might not have a lease of your own, you might not have any guaranteed amount of time to stay, but that's also not technically considered literally homeless according to HUD. Once again, temporarily staying with other people. If you are in a hospital or a jail with no stable exit, that's also not really considered homeless. We technically, if you're in one of those spaces for more than a certain period of time, you lose your homelessness status and you don't qualify for housing anymore. And then if you're paying for a hotel or a motel on an ongoing basis, it's the only place you have to stay, but you're paying for it on your own, that's also not considered homeless. So what this means is that there's a whole chunk of people who are not qualifying for housing services and are not considered homeless by the government. So when we talk next about like numbers in homelessness, it's all really focused on this, like this literal definition. Just important to, in my opinion, to sort of like broaden our view a little bit, that like homelessness is actually largely invisible too. It's people who maybe we don't see and we don't capture in some of the ways we try to count homelessness. It's not always just the people who are like, literally on the streets or kind of wandering in and out of park spaces. It could be people who are just really unstable and they might not even identify as homeless themselves. And a lot of organizations will work with people in both these categories, but a lot of housing resources come down to this. So that's the first thing that I kind of want to make sure people are aware of, is that homelessness is actually not just like the visible people on the streets. There's a lot of nuance there. And that, according to some of the big counts that we do, a lot of people are really not, their situations aren't considered like desperate enough to be homeless. It's also worth naming that if you look at school data, Denver school data shows that like all of these are considered unhoused. The Denver public school system really broadens their view. And so if you look at people who are in these sort of situations, the number of just kiddos within the Denver public school system is like more than 2,000 people every school year who are in one of these situations, like if you broaden it to include both categories. So just a little bit of like awareness building there. But if we look at just the literal homeless definition, that definition the government uses, this is kind of what homelessness has looked like in recent years in Denver. You see that it's obviously increasing quite a bit. When we get to 2021, we took a break because of COVID, but the next number that we have, the most recent big count that was done was 4,794 people. And what I want to say is this number is really inaccurate. The way that we get this number is a bunch of people go out in the middle of winter and try to count people on one night. It's called the point in time because it's a big way that we determine federal funding. It's sort of done across the whole country on the last Monday in January. And it's really like volunteer run. It's really time limited. Like you're only looking at one night. And there's a lot of people that we end up missing because in the middle of winter, people are like as sheltered as they possibly can be. I used to know youth who slept like in like the stairwell of a parking garage, for example, so they wouldn't be in the snow. And a group of volunteers going out to count people is not going to really capture that person, for example. And so the sheltered number is pretty accurate. So this is because people have to scan a card and give their name when they stay at a shelter, but our unsheltered number is like pretty inaccurate. And I want to show you the breakdown. According to that most recent count that we did in Denver, only about a quarter of the people who are experiencing homelessness are unsheltered. So if you're thinking about like driving through Denver and you picture lots of tents and lots of people on the streets, only about a quarter of what we see is like the reality. And that's only that like more narrow definition too. So what this shows us is that over 50% of people are staying in shelters. Once again, it actually isn't quite that high of a percentage because of the skew and the way we count the numbers, but there is a lot of people that access emergency shelter, but there's also a lot of people who don't. There's a lot of people who are either, not able to access shelter for various reasons. One thing I really want to point out is that there's not a lot of shelter options for families. There's not a lot of shelter options for women. There's not a lot of shelter options for people who are partnered. So if you were like, I really want to stay in a shelter, but I really want my partner with me, there are very, very few options. If you have an animal that you don't want to part ways with, very few shelter options. If you are transgender, which there's a huge, like disproportionate percentage of the population who experiences homelessness is also transgender. And there is like one like safe shelter for adults, the Dolores Project. And they're awesome, but it's super limited shelter beds. And so there's a lot of reasons why people might choose to not stay in shelter. The other thing I want to name right now, without going too far into it, is currently we also have a really big influx of migrants who are experiencing homelessness, and the migrant shelter is turning people away every night and is working on like limiting the number of beds they have to be even smaller. So there's a lot happening behind shelter that's actually like not it's not that there's a lot of shelter beds and people are just choosing the streets. There's a lot of nuance about why people might not be in a shelter and why they are staying in tents. And so once again, I like to kind of point that out to people because there can be a lot of misconceptions around like, maybe there's never enough shelter beds. So, well, there might be beds, but they're not the right kind of beds. And people like don't want to sleep away from their partner or their wife or their husband, or they don't want to like have to get rid of their dog to stay inside. There's so many different things that can be happening for people there. But when people do stay in shelter, I do just want to name that there's a lot of different types. Like Denver is kind of doing some cool things, especially around tiny homes, where people have the option. They fill up really fast, so I don't want to make it sound like it's an option for a lot of people, but where people can have their own space, and it's meant to be transitional, so people can like transition from the streets into having a space of their own before they move into having an apartment. And it's tiny homes in spaces where other people are also there who they might know from the streets, or people they can build community with, and there's staff there to help them with things. We also have congregate shelters, which are kind of more tons of people in a space. Like if you picture some of the emergency shelters in Denver, like bunk beds all kind of smashed together. And especially during COVID, that was really hard. They've tried really hard to do distancing there, but there's only so much you can do when you're trying to shelter like hundreds of thousands of people at night. There are more transitional shelter options where people can maybe pay per week or per month for a bed and have a little bit more stability there. So they're not just showing up to a big, giant warehousey space, but they're guaranteed the same bed every night in some of these transitional shelter options. Once again, there's family shelter options. There's not a lot. And there's also youth shelter options. And Urban Peak is the only one in Denver, but there's also a youth shelter in Boulder, and there's one in Colorado Springs. So we have a couple places we can kind of work with if we run out of space in our shelter at Urban Peak. And for all those reasons that I named, there's lots of people who don't want to stay in overnight shelters, or sometimes there's just straight up not the bed space. And so I did want to name that there are also services for people who are unsheltered too. So the big one that I think is where my heart really lives is street outreach. And the whole heart of street outreach is literally just how do we meet people where they're at? How do we go to where people are, people who might be having mental health crises, people who might be really scared to access services, people who might have no idea where the service providers are. And outreach workers will go to them and bring things like sleeping bags and clean socks and snacks and bus tickets, and just connect with people and make sure that they have some help navigating services. And I have seen everything from helping people get into housing, helping people get IDs, helping people reconnect with family. So much cool work happens there. And one of the things I'll give you later on is that if you are interacting with people who are unhoused, there's actually a city-run outreach team that if you call 311, which is one, it's different from 911. 311 it's like non-emergency sort of city services. They will dispatch an outreach team to come work with people. And it might not be immediate. It's not going to be like they zoom over in a vehicle, but usually within a couple of days, they'll send an outreach team to go interact with someone and follow up on whatever the request was made. So there are some cool ways to use street outreach to really help people who are in crisis, and maybe people who don't seem to be regularly accessing services or having basic needs met. There's a program to like help with that, which is really cool. And we also have safe outdoor spaces in Denver. It's a really cool thing that has happened since I think it was like mid 2020 that we finally started rolling them out. But those are spaces that are designated for people to sleep in tents. And while they're in those tents, there are staff on site, there's bathrooms, there's electricity. And the guarantee is that the police aren't going to come and move your tent. And so people are kind of giving up a little bit of freedom because there's some staff oversight and there's definitely some rules, but they are choosing that option so that they don't have to be worried about having to interact with police or having to get moved in the middle of the night or, really early the next morning or something. And so that's a cool thing that is offered to people who don't want to stay in shelter and might want to choose that in between. It's an option where people can have pets and people can often sleep with partners. And so it's a space that is spaces, there's multiple across town, but that is kind of a nice in between for people. And there's also day centers. There's a bunch of buildings where people can access showers, sometimes food, sometimes case management. It depends on the space, but Denver Rescue Mission runs one. St. Francis Center runs one. Urban Peak runs a day center. And I would be missing something if I didn't talk about libraries, which tend to actually function like day centers because it's free internet and there's books and there's places to sit and you're not going to get told to leave. And so people often end up just wanting to go and like stay and hang out in libraries, which is when I was an outreach worker, we would always just go walk through library floors and find people who maybe were new to the city and they didn't have anywhere to stay and they just were hanging out in libraries because there was internet and it was safe. Libraries, social workers are really awesome and peer navigators in the library too to help people access resources. So what I realized, because I've been doing this for so long, is the more that I teach new staff who come into my organization, a lot of people don't know this stuff exists, even if they're in this sort of field. So I felt like it was important to kind of tell you the kind of resources that are out there, because there really are a lot of people doing a lot of things to try to support people who are experiencing homelessness. So kind of wanted to name some of that. And then what about housing? Because of course, I think sometimes it can be like, why don't people just like work on getting housing? So it's worth naming that in the last like fiscal year, 3,900 individuals or households in Denver applied for housing through Denver has sort of this system where you basically fill out one survey expressing your interest in housing. You do that with a case manager at any of the sort of services that I mentioned. And it gets you kind of on the list for housing. There are so many people waiting to get housing resources, and there are just not enough resources at all. And so people can apply, and it's not even a wait list where you wait for your name to move up. You're prioritized based on how vulnerable you are, which is a cool system because people who are really vulnerable can get housed a lot quicker. But if you have someone who comes in and they're like working really hard and they're trying to do like what they need to do to like access services and take care of their mental health and all this stuff, they might not be considered as vulnerable and they might just be waiting a long time. The hope there is that, that we can maybe find like an affordable housing place for that person to live, or they can eventually save up enough money to like get their own place. But it's a really clogged up system in terms of resources. And it's worth naming that of the people that applied, like 1 in 3 of those people were experiencing homelessness for the first time. It's not like they've been on the streets for a really long time. It's like people who are new to the streets and are looking for a way to get out of that situation. So the barriers around getting housing, once again, are just the amount of resources. Like we need so many more, but also like making and keeping an appointment. I've known a lot of clients who are like, I don't like, whether maybe they don't have a phone or they don't have a watch and they're like, I have no idea what time it is. And what if their camp ends up getting moved to across town and they're supposed to be downtown for an appointment? It's like the ability to actually follow through on appointments. There's actually so many barriers there. Being able to communicate consistently, if you don't have internet access, for example, or if your phone gets stolen. Transportation can be really inconsistent across town, and bus fares are actually pretty expensive if you don't have an income. And being able to find your way to where different apartments are that you're applying for, or meetings with a potential landlord, or meetings with a potential case manager, getting around town to those sort of things can be a lot. I also want to name background checks can be a huge barrier for people. There are some vouchers that won't take people, even if they have like a really low level misdemeanor. Like, it just depends on the housing resource. But there are people who can be excluded from a lot of housing resources just if they have like a really minor run-in with the criminal justice system. And keep that in mind, because I'm about to also tell you about like why that's such a big deal for people who are unhoused. There's also a lot of fees associated with all of this. I had a youth once, they were matched to a housing voucher, and we're like, absolutely, that's so exciting. And that voucher didn't cover application fees or security deposit or a holding fee. And we had to then all of a sudden apply for all these other funding sources to try to get money to be able to like support that youth, just to use their housing voucher, just to like use the voucher they already got, required a bunch of other applications. So it's pretty wild how some of these systems end up working. And then you have to have vital documents to be able to get a housing voucher. To be able to get that sort of financial housing support, it requires an ID and a birth certificate and a social security card. And so what I'll name right off the bat is there are people who are excluded from that, people who are undocumented, people who do not have like legal status in this country are often, I mean, disqualified from, I'd say like 99% of the housing resources for people who are unhoused. So huge barrier there. And then it is really hard to get vital documents. I don't know if y'all have ever had to do that. I was helping someone navigate getting an ID once, who he knew his legal name. He did not know his social security number. He had never had an ID in his life. He had never held his birth certificate. He literally just knew his name, and that was it, and his birthday. And so we had, it was a year-long process to get him even just a birth certificate. It was like sleuth detective work happening, which is why it's so important to have like resources and case managers and stuff who can help with that. But it's a pretty wild situation out there to try to get vital documents. So in the midst of all of this, as people are unhoused and not really able to like access housing services, or maybe are like scared to access shelter services, there is a lot of criminalization happening in Denver right now that this is not meant to even be like a political statement. It is just kind of telling you the facts. We have had an unauthorized camping ordinance is what it's officially called. People call it the camping ban. That has been in existence in Denver for 11 years now. That ordinance basically makes it so it is illegal for people to sleep anywhere in any sort of public place. What that means is a police officer technically could come up to them and give them a citation right then and there. I'll say that typically doesn't happen, and people will get a warning and say like, hey, you need to move your stuff or you're going to get a citation. But it also means that people are having a lot more interactions with law enforcement. So anytime that, a police officer comes up to a camp and maybe, hey, you need to get moving, like you can't be here. That's just another interaction where people's names could get run. So any old warrants they might have, even if it's like a really minor warrant, all of a sudden they could get arrested for that. If people happen to have like drug paraphernalia or anything like that, that's another sort of like interaction with law enforcement. We also have a sit and lie ordinance in the downtown grid, which means it's illegal for people to sit or lie down within the downtown grid of Denver, on and within 50 feet of 16th Street Mall. It's also illegal to smoke. You can kind of imagine who is targeted by that, and it's usually not the people who are working in like fancy buildings downtown or living in fancy buildings downtown. It is people who appear unhoused and are lacking other places to smoke or sit or lie down. there's also like a bicycle and skateboard ban on 16th Street Mall, which makes sense. It's a very pedestrian area. It is also a space where like there just tends to be a lot of people who are unhoused who might be skateboarding or biking there too. So all of these are just, once again, just like layers and layers and layers of interaction with law enforcement, which has opened people up to like so many opportunities to get citations, to get arrested, to have lethal interactions with law enforcement potentially, or really painful or violent interactions with law enforcement. There's also trespassing charges I've seen used all the time. That could just be, instead of using the unauthorized camping ordinance, it's if people are in front of like a business or a home, and then the business owner or the homeowner would call for a trespassing charge. And so I've had, I mean, I couldn't even count the number of clients that I've had who've had trespassing charges for choosing to sleep in one of those spaces. Technically, people can like ask for money or like fly a sign, but if it's considered aggressive, that is something that's illegal. And I just want to point out that like who determines what aggressive is. I think there's a lot of people who end up living on the streets who don't have their basic needs met, and also simultaneously have mental health problems. And when those people are maybe asking for money, I think it maybe could be perceived as aggressive, and that's, you know, can be an immediate call to the police. And if you're each telling your side of the story, I think it's there are ways in which people who are unhoused tend to not be believed. And then I always like to say that like there's kind of this catch-all, like just disturbing the peace, that if someone is just kind of like loud and in public, that's a reason to get arrested sometimes. There's other things I'm not even listing on here, like petty theft. I've had clients get citations for like stealing like period products from stores, which makes sense. I mean, it's stealing, but it's also like really basic needs that just aren't met. And so all of this can kind of point to like, what are the needs that are not being met here? Like there's people who need a place to stay, need money, need like a place to sit and lie down. And it's really, I think, pointing to like a lot of the needs that just aren't being met when people are on the streets and in some of these situations. There's also this displacement that happens with specifically the enforcement of the urban camping ban, that as some of these downtown areas continue to just get gentrified more and more, some of that, when you combine it with these urban camping restrictions, just kind of pushes people are either around Denver or to the outside of city centers. Part of what happens is that because there's like kind of inconsistent public transportation, depending on the part of town, if it is consistent, it's expensive. It can be really hard to maintain like contact to case managers or service providers and to access some of those centrally located services. All of that just means, at least, I mean, once again, in my experience as an outreach worker, was just like increasingly hard to follow through on case management, housing appointments, maybe medical needs you might have, and eventually to exit homelessness. Like there's just infinite barriers that pop up if you're staying in inconsistent places. There was, I feel like it's worth telling the story of, there was a youth I was working with, and just like kindest dude, and he had gotten accepted to housing, and he'd been on the streets for probably 5 years, and he was so excited. And then his camp got moved and we were not able to find him. And the housing resource said, you have like 3 days. And so my other outreach worker who I was working with at the time, the two of us just like took off and literally for days just like searched for this kid in like parks and every library we could think of and like every light rail station, and eventually like found him. We're like, you need to get to this building like right now or you're going to lose your housing. And things like that just happened where he's like, I had no way to get downtown. Like I didn't know how to get there. He ended up being like South Inglewood, almost on the border of Littleton when we found him. And he's like, I had no idea it was that urgent. Like I thought it was going to take a lot longer. We're like, we know, we found you. And they're like, that has a positive outcome of like, that kid got housed and it was awesome. But it took 2 outreach workers basically giving up like 3 full work days. So some of like the byproduct of this like constant moving around is things like that, where it's just increasingly hard for people to feel stable and to end up exiting homelessness. And in part because of that constant instability, the constant moving around, there ends up being a lot of barriers that people face while they're unhoused. Some of this is also people who are maybe in shelters, like might experience some of this, but this is a lot of like people who are maybe like literally on the streets or in a tent. And some of like the first layer of this is just access to like your most basic needs. So things like clean clothes, like there's a lot of service providers who will help to hand out clothes, but they get dirty so quickly, especially if you think about winter or the amount of rain we've been having. I'm someone that bikes everywhere. I had 2 pairs of pants today get completely muddy just from like being outside on my bike on the streets. And you think about like, okay, if you got 2 pairs of clothes or like 2 outfits from a service provider and you had them in your backpack, and then the pouring rain that happened earlier today, like all of a sudden you have no clothes again, right? And so I think about that constantly just because it was the most consistent need that I saw people have. And I love working at Urban Peak where we have laundry machines, because at least I can be like, let's toss it in there. Like we can make these clean again. We can fix the problem. But if you're not a youth, it's pretty hard to access like free laundry services. There's not a ton of options. There's laundry trucks that go around. But it's hard. It's hard to make that happen. A place to store your things. I think that also really actually lends itself to the clean clothes problem is you really can only have a couple of things at a time because you have to carry everything that you own. And so there are places where you can get locker access. Our drop-in center and our shelter, for example, both programs have lockers accessible for people to keep some things. But I like to do some awareness, like it is the size of like my high school gym locker. Like it's not like you can fit a lot of things in there. And I think about like the closet that I have, and if I had to kind of choose what to keep to fit in there, I'd have like 2 pairs of shoes and like a jumpsuit and a winter coat. And like, I mean, and those are just like logistical things, but I've seen a lot of clients trying to keep things like photos that matter to them, or journals, or like the books that they want to have. And just a place to store things is like, it's hard to find. Bathrooms, if you're sleeping anywhere downtown, like it is, if it's nighttime, it is next to impossible to find a bathroom, like a public restroom where you can go to the bathroom legally. I think I was trying to map it out within like where our building is downtown, 22nd and Stout-ish. It's like about like a mile radius before you can find a restroom to use, like a public restroom. Union Station is really like the big one that people end up being able to use because it's like a public space technically. But there's also all kinds of barriers there that I won't get into. And not being able to use the bathroom is just like, oh my God, like, especially if it's the middle of the night and you need to use the bathroom. Like yeah, it is like a constant barrier for people. And once again, like the awareness building that I kind of like to do around this is that there are some people in my life and folks that I know, even who are in this work, who get really frustrated when there's like poop or pee around buildings or like in parks, or like, and I hear that. And it's one of those moments where you can look at if that need was already being met and then they chose to poop there. Totally disrespectful. Like if there was a bathroom 50 feet away and they chose that, that's so disrespectful. But like if there's not a bathroom anywhere within a mile, if you woke up in the middle of the night, like I would probably pee in my backyard. I'm gonna be super honest. If I didn't have a bathroom, like I would pee the first patch of grass I probably found. And there is just a lot there that is so undignifying, I think, to not be able to have that really basic need met. And to then have the public perception that it's like really unclean and really unsanitary and people can't take care of themselves. It's like, what else are they supposed to do? Like, there's really not, that option like really does not exist. Especially once again at night. And during the day, there are some places that will totally let folks use their bathroom, but not a lot of options after a certain hour. Our drop-in center closes at 8. And so I like to say after 8 o'clock, it's just like anyone's game. You just don't know what area is going to become the bathroom. And then medication and reliable healthcare. We usually see about, and once again, I work with youth, but about 60% of our clients come into our program saying that they have a notable mental health problem. These are just people under 25. And we also have about 20 to 30% of our youth coming
Y
in
también
reporting
tenemos como 20 a 30.
medication. There are folks who just like desperately need regular access to medication, and like, once again, if all these other basic needs are not met, like I've seen people get meds and be so excited about them, and then they get stolen or they get lost, or they like don't have anywhere to keep them. And so that becomes just a super basic need of like, how do you function as a human throughout the day? That a lot of folks who really do need to be receiving medication to help stabilize their health don't have consistent access to. This leads to a lot of things, like access to really basic logistical necessities are not present for a lot of folks, like a consistent mailing address, a consistent phone number. I think part of it is not being able to pay a phone bill, but if you do end up having a free phone, I'll just tell you from my time working in this field that phones get lost or stolen a lot, or get water damage really quickly. And they're not kind of the fancy phones that are waterproof. And having internet access, right? Having a place where you can check your email. Well, the other thing I meant to mention about phone numbers is I've had so many folks that I work with get locked out of their email because their phone number has changed, because of this two-factor authentication thing that is so important, but is everywhere now. And so if you're logging into your email and it's like, hey, we don't actually recognize this computer, maybe because you only can use computers in libraries, so you use a different one every time. But like, hey, we don't recognize you. Can we call your phone number to verify it's you? And they're like, oh no, I haven't had that phone number for 3 years. So people end up getting locked out of emails or social media, bank accounts, all that kind of stuff without having the same phone number. Our like modern technological world was not meant for people who like have a constantly rotating phone number. It just like is not set up for that. Anyways, and then access to internet. Once again, like libraries, awesome place, but I think internet is becoming actually almost more of a basic need than like a logistical necessity, but folks really might not have consistent access to those sort of things. And then vital documents, like I mentioned, are really hard. And so some of like the barriers that result from that are like, not only like I said to follow through on job applications, which is super true, but also just to apply for jobs in general. There recently actually was a youth I was working with he was like, I applied to like 3 jobs. I'm like, cool, have you heard back? And he said, I haven't actually had internet to check my email. I'm like, okay, well, that is important. I'm like, did you give a phone number? He's like, oh yeah, it was my case manager's phone number, but I haven't seen my case manager in 2 weeks. I'm like, oh no. And so just like the things that I think I for sure take for granted or are easy to like forget how necessary they are things that people regularly lack access to on the streets. Leads to things like difficulty with attendance at work or at school, and inconsistent communication with support networks. And really like all of this, I think, just leads to this, like, there's not a lot of just basic human dignity present for folks while they're in these situations. And then the kind of the last piece of this like intro to homelessness that I want to talk about is just like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to this place? And there's so many things we could talk about around like lack of affordable housing and, you know, pretty like wild increase in cost of living and not being able to pay people living wages. And like, there's so many policy choices that go into all of that. But if we look back even further, the big thing that I actually want to touch on, and once again, this could be a whole different training in terms of how did we get to this place, is this policy choice that was made in the 1930s. FDR, in the wake of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and in the wake of the Great Depression, comes out with the New Deal. And part of that is this act that helps people to get housing to purchase a home. And so for the first time, there's things like fixed low interest mortgage rates and 30-year mortgage so that people can pay for a home slowly over a long period of time. So this is this like monumental thing to like help to generate like generational wealth and community wealth, and to be able to buy a property even if you're not super wealthy. This was like so important. And they also, in the creation of this, were like, how do we determine who to give loans out to though? Because we can't just give a loan to everybody. And so they created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which created these maps that would basically say like, this is an area where people typically are like qualified, like should be qualified to like have a home loan. And these are areas where people like really shouldn't be qualified. And the biggest determining factor across the board, up and down the income scale, was race. If you were foreign born or Negro is the terms that they use, if you checked yes in either of those boxes, it was like abysmal chances that you would qualify for a loan. This is Denver. This is Denver in 1938. This is our redlining map for like downtown Denver. This whole area, because it was red, was deemed like unfit, like will default on their mortgage, do not give money to these people. Once again, doesn't mean that they actually were more likely to default on their mortgages. There's no proof that people like would not have been able to be just as efficient as homeowners at paying back the banks. This was fully like a racialized decision. And when we look at the history of housing and how this has played out, and I know this was a long time ago, but this existed till 1964 when we had the Fair Housing Act pass. And even now, to this day, there is still a greater chance for a white person than a Black person to apply for or to like be approved for a loan, no matter where you look at the income scale. Same level of income, and a white person is more likely to be approved for a loan. So there's just so much behind our history of housing and how we have decided to like distribute housing resources. And what that has led to is things like a really big disproportion when we look at who is experiencing homelessness. So it's not just that like,
Está experimentando la falta de vivienda.
If we look at the homeless population compared to the census for this area, what you see is like a 4 times overrepresentation of Black people. And white people are like about 30% less of the population who are unhoused than of people who are just like the general population. So this top line on this graph that I'm showing you is the census for this area. And the bottom red line is the homeless population. And so what you see is that white people are really underrepresented, and multiracial people, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks, American Indian and Alaska Natives, and Black folks are like highly overrepresented among people who are unhoused. Same goes for ethnicity. If you just look at people who are not Hispanic or not Latine, it's like 77 like those folks make up about 77% of the population in Denver. But if you just look at the homeless population, it's only 62%. So what I like to say is the best way to interpret this data is if all things were equal, which they are not, if all things were equal, you would really expect this, both of these lines to match up, and they don't. So what you do see is that there's about a 12% gap between how many people are in the census and identify as Latine and how many people are unhoused. Just to break this down in a way that's maybe a little easier than the graphs, is that there's a 3.6 times overrepresentation among people who are Black or African American, 2.6 times overrepresentation for people who are multiracial, 4 times overrepresentation for people who are Indigenous, and 4.5 times overrepresentation for people who are Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And so there is like a notable racial disparity among people who are experiencing homelessness. And in terms of like how did this happen, I think that's why it's important to like kind of remember the political and like policy choices that we've made as a country that have, I think, really directly impacted why this looks the way it looks. It's also super important to bring up intersectionality here. This is a term coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw. works at Columbia Law. This is a term rooted in like legal categorical exclusion, which just means that like if you are a woman, you like face discrimination in terms of like, so this was actually rooted in employment like legal history. You're a woman, there was some legal rights to protect you in terms of like equality in the workplace. If you were a Black man, there was some policies starting to happen that protected you in the workplace. But if you were a Black woman, they would say, well, technically, like we cover women and we cover men, but like, so we're already checking our like diversity boxes we have to check. So Black women didn't fit in terms of like legal protection around employment and discrimination. And so that's where this term came from. Really messy history. And what this means is that there is this like overlap of historically excluded identities that can
Una
lead to
conexión entre las identidades históricas.
reality is that like a lot of us have identities that are kind of a complicated mess of oppressed and oppressor. And I want to just kind of give an example on the next slide. Really love this like this visual representation of power and privilege, but showing like people in the center who like have the most power, people who are able-bodied, neurotypical, slim body size, own property, English speaking, cisgender man, citizens in this country. But if you look at the outside of people who are more marginalized in their identity, a lot of people that I speak with or talk to have a combination of these identities, right? But what we see among people who are unhoused is a lot of these marginalized identities, like so many of them. And specifically, there's a huge overrepresentation of people who are LGBTQ and people of color. Like those are kind of the two big intersections that we see. But honestly, people like they're homeless, often are not able to like make like high amounts of money just due to education status. Lots of people who don't speak English or have learned English, people who are transgender, people who are undocumented, like there are so many people at the outside of this circle with marginalized identities, where there's just not a lot of like legal protection, or these systems have not been set up in a way that is meant to protect these people and give them housing resources and give them loans, right? And so it just ends up perpetuating itself, a lot of these systems around homelessness. What this looks like in practice, I love this. This is from youth homelessness specifically, but I kind of like this visual, is that if you talk to just youth who are white and not LGBTQ, only about 4% of them experience homelessness. Like that's a significant number, but it's not huge. That number basically doubles if you look at just youth who are Black or just youth who are white and queer. Basically, your chance of experiencing homelessness doubles, but your chance of experiencing homelessness doubles again if you are both Black and LGBTQ. So what you see is like exponential increase in risk of homelessness when you add on multiple identities. And that was a lot of info, and I appreciate y'all hanging in there. I wanted to pause and take a second and just see if there was any like questions or thoughts that you want to type into the chat. If there's like questions I can help to circle back and answer right now, I'm more than willing to. And otherwise, we will move on to some stuff around trauma. I'll give it a couple seconds. Cool. Either I did a good job explaining that, or there's so many questions that you don't know where to start. And so either way, we can chat later if you want. But I'm gonna start talking about trauma. So because of like everything
No entendieron nada.
people experience on the streets, the criminalization of homelessness, how historically excluded and historically oppressed identities are like at really high risk of experiencing homelessness compared to other people. What we find is that there's just constantly people who've experienced trauma who end up in situations where they're unhoused. And so this is going to be kind of a cheesy analogy, and so I'm going to just ask for you to stick with me, this is rooted in an analogy that like is very real. Bessel van der Kolk, who I think is one of the most like profound and like well-known examples of a trauma expert. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which there's like, at least in the part of the internet that I'm on, there's constantly memes about it. But he has this metaphor that talks about the brain's response to stress. And I just adapted it to be like a little bit more modern, because he talks about a watchtower and like a smoke alarm. And I'm like, we're going to talk about a smoke alarm and like a security camera, just to kind of make it like a present day situation. So a little less outdated. So our brains are constantly responding to stress. We are geared up to respond to stress as humans. That is just like how we exist in the world. How I like to explain this is that first there's some kind of a stressor. We're going to use the example of like smoke, right? So maybe you're in your house and you like smell smoke. That's kind of like, oh, there's something happening that's a little bit not normal and stresses me out. And like, I don't know what the cause is. The thalamus is going to be the part of our brain that first like perceives what's happening and makes it make sense. So instead of having fragmented ideas of what is happening around us, we have a cohesive perception of the world that we're taking in. And so instead of like just hearing like sounds or smells or things that we're seeing, it's like we have like one cohesive perception of what's happening in the world around us. Bessel van der Kolk refers to this as like the cook of the brain, because it's taking together all of like sights, sounds, perceptions, all these things, and turning it into like a cake, right? So instead of having like eggs and milk and flour, you just have a cake. This is really important because like when we perceive what is happening that is stressful around us, it's like really great when it makes sense and it's not like disjointed and confusing. So we take in the stress that's happening, and the cook of the brain sends it to two places. One is the medial prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that I'm going to describe as the security camera. This part of the brain is like the logical part of the brain, processes information, it has important details. It's really important for us to like engage with this part of the brain to think logically about like, okay, there's smoke in the room. I could call 911. I should probably figure out the source of the smoke. I should probably make sure there's no one else in the house, right? Like you're like logically thinking through how to respond. But the thalamus also sends information to the amygdala, which is like the most famous part of the brain. So if you've ever been in any kind of like spaces that talk about trauma, the amygdala is like maybe something you've heard of. This is the part of the brain that triggers our fight and flight response, as like a very simplistic way of describing it. We're going to describe this as the smoke detector of the brain, because all this part of the brain knows is like, pay attention, there's an emergency, like sounding the alarm. This is so important because we, in a real emergency, like we need to know, like, you got to get out of the house right now. It's so important that we have part of our bodies that know, like, this is an emergency, you need to gear up to run away, or like you need to gear up for battle. So important. And in an ideal stress response, what's happening is these two share information with each other. So we're not just like logically processing things. There's a little bit of us that's like freaking out, but we're also able to take that part that's freaking out and like logic our way through to like a good response. This is like, once again, the very simplistic version of like an ideal way of responding to stress, is we like perceive the stress, maybe start freaking out a little bit, and then are able to kind of like sift through the information that we have and make the best decision possible for ourselves. These two parts of the brain, smoke detector, security cameras, have to like work together to kind of understand like the best way to respond and move forward. When we have trauma, there's an overwhelming stressor to the point that we're not able to slow down and sift through the security camera material. So part of what happens is that because of the overwhelming sensations, our ability to sort of make that cohesive cake out of our sights, sounds, surroundings, all of our senses kind of like tickling, things become really disjointed. We're not able to make something super coherent out of the things that we're taking in. And so this part of our brain, which is used to giving us something really smooth and easy to like digest, is kind of freaking out. So when people have been through trauma, especially like a traumatic event of some kind, like something like really acute that has happened. It is pretty common for people to say like it felt like everything slowed down, or all I can remember is this color.
Como que todo se movía lento o que solo recuerdan un color.
It's so disjointed. And the part of our brain that perceives things is kind of freaking out. The other thing that happens is because we need the fast response time, because it's so overwhelming, once again, we don't have the time to consult the security cameras of the brain. I like to say that in one of the apartment complexes that we own as Urban Peak has very sensitive smoke detectors. And what happens is someone could be like boiling water and the smoke detector like thinks it's smoke and like sounds the alarm. And so unfortunately, for people who've experienced trauma, their brain like will have the super hypersensitive smoke detector all the time sometimes. And if you are someone that's living with a lot of trauma and you've had this sort of overwhelming amount of stress in your brain, it might not feel like you're able to slow down and logically process the information because the smoke alarm is constantly going off. And yeah, and so I think it's important to also name that like this is protective, this is good, this is our like body and brain being really resilient to be able to respond to situations that can be like really overwhelming and scary. The ability to do this is a protective thing that is like so important that we have. And when you are someone who's gone through a lot of trauma or are constantly living trauma, your brain might look like this all the time, even if it's not actually a house fire, even if we're just back to smoke, even if it's just like grandma smoking a cigarette in the kitchen, or like you're burning your cookies a little bit.
Claro, en la cocina, o quizás se te están quemando las galletas.
Can trigger this response. And so, especially for people who are unhoused, and we think back to like maybe the constant interactions with law enforcement, a lot of that kind of stuff that can be happening on a regular basis. When those sort of things are constantly happening, you might never have the ability to like calm down and re-engage with like the logical part of your brain and like actively make like conscious decisions about how you're going to respond to things. Your brain might constantly be living out here. This impacts us in a lot of ways. One of them is just, I kind of mentioned this, but threats kind of become everywhere. You sort of can be hypersensitive and hyperreactive to stress stimuli that other people might be like, yeah, that was like annoying that there was a loud noise, but why are we freaking out right now? And like, well, like I grew up in this neighborhood with gang violence, and I like constantly heard shots, gunshots in the middle of the night. And so anytime there's like a loud noise, your brain goes back to that traumatic response, right? There is also, once again, that like kind of ruptured relationship that makes it harder for the brain to respond logically to threats or to perceived threats. And a constant example of this in the spaces that I work in is maybe, you know, we have a client who's like, hey, do you have an extra sleeping bag? It's like, I'm so sorry, we're out of sleeping bags today. And someone will respond like it is the end of the world, and like they're yelling at staff like, you know, you don't care about us at all, like just so mad at everyone around them. And it's so important for like, at least for me and some of the staff members that I work with, to like be able to think through and be like, okay, like your brain is in like trauma space, like you're kind of responding to the sleeping bag as if it's the house fire, right? And for us to be able to slow down and say like, well, what is behind the scenes for this person? Might be that they, you know, have never consistently had their needs met, maybe like had some pretty extreme situations where they like almost froze multiple times due to being too cold. Like you just never know what someone's going to be going through, or what the trigger could be for somebody. And the other thing I want to name is just that that very real reality that the body just kind of will respond to small triggers as if they're really big emergencies, because we kind of can't consult that other side of the brain. And there's also a lot of other impacts of trauma, like that just kind of like as you're going about the world, as you're kind of like moving through the space, of life and interacting with people, there can be that hypersensitivity and hyperreactivity all the time. The other thing is part of what comes from that is you have stress hormones constantly hanging out in your body. You are constantly on edge. Maybe you're constantly like stressed about what's happening. And if that is the constant state of being that you're living in, that has a huge impact on your both psychological health and your physiological health. So things like chronic illness, things like self-harming, things like mental health problems, disordered eating, substance dependency. These are just some examples, but it shows up in a lot of different ways in both like our bodies and our mental health and our brains. And there are some even more like acute things that I didn't want to go too in depth here, but one pretty extreme example is a young person I know who has really severe PTSD, is literally currently just having blackout periods of memory, like extreme memory loss, not tied to substance use, not tied to a lack of sleep. It is just like huge chunks of time that like throughout the day, they'll like live 5 hours, get to the end of the 5 hours and not remember a single minute of it. And weird memory loss is also really tied to severe trauma. And that's a whole other thing, but like there's an impact, right? There's an impact to the way that our brains are working on a regular basis, to the way our bodies feel, some of the coping skills we end up developing. Huge way that trauma ends up like impacting our daily lives. And I'm seeing there's a question. I'm going to pause at the end of this section and I will make sure to answer some of whatever's coming up. And I think it's important to also name like what are some of the causes of trauma, right? Like I think people go through a lot of things, and trauma sometimes can just be this buzzword for like anything bad that happens. This is just an image out of a scholarly article that I thought was helpful. But there can be things like adverse childhood experiences, which is listed at the top here, which are like very acute, maybe experiences that you have had as a kid, had earlier on in your life. But there's also some of these like isms, right? Of like ageism, bullying, ableism, sexism, racism. All of these are also forms of trauma that people experience. And some of the ways that plays out in terms of like microaggressions, like community violence. All of these are just like, I thought this was a pretty comprehensive list of like some of the things that can be perceived as trauma. And unfortunately for this sort of conversation, a lot of times conversations around trauma just hang out in this world of less adverse childhood experiences, or things like domestic violence or sexual violence, which are all absolutely forms of trauma, but the list is actually so much more expansive than that. And that there's like individual trauma, interpersonal trauma, and also collective trauma. There's layers to all of this. It's not just things that you as an individual experience. It could be things that you have experienced in the context of family, or things that you have experienced because you're part of a community that's been historically oppressed. So trauma actually can look like a lot of different things. And this is an image out of the book My Grandmother's Hands. This author is Reza Menakem. He's a brilliant expert around in the field of like racial trauma specifically, and how that kind of shows up and lodges in our bodies. I just thought this was a helpful image in terms of expanding the way that we view trauma as well. Sort of takes that list from the other page and puts it in a triangle, which is a nice shape. But when we have conversations around trauma that only look at the top half of this triangle, things like adverse childhood experiences and how that leads to some of these like social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, or adoption of high-risk behavior. You also, I mean, this is all very true. You see a correlation between like adverse childhood experiences and things like disease, or disabilities, like especially developmental disabilities. You also see a correlation between a lot of adverse childhood experiences and potentially an early death. Like there's a lot of correlation here to look at when we think about the impact trauma has. But the triangle doesn't actually start there. The triangle around trauma starts with like historical trauma, things like intergenerational trauma, like policy choices that we've made that have impacted like entire groups of people. And then also like intergenerational trauma that maybe our parents or grandparents have experienced, or our families have experienced. And so there's so much more to the conversation around trauma. All of this is really important when we think back to that conversation around redlining, for example, and this intentional policy choice that was made by the United States that has then had this spiral effect and leads to like certain groups of people having more experiences of homelessness, which just like spirals its way up, right? Into then that leads to more trauma, and that leads to more experiences where you're on the streets and are interacting with police or don't have your basic needs met. And so all of this can spiral a lot. This is my absolute favorite way to talk about all of this in the most simple way, is that the goal here is not to be like these people that look at someone who is maybe experiencing homelessness and is like, oh, this person's experienced trauma, like this person has a mental health problem, which is like so important to name, but it's also important to say like, I wonder why this person has a mental health problem. Like, I wonder why this person has trauma. I wonder why this person is carrying this around. And it's so much about like kind of the world that they're in. And especially I think when we think about people who are unhoused, it is the daily experience of more trauma, more exposure to like not having your needs met, more potential to get assaulted, more potential to have messy run-ins with police officers, more opportunities to get like harassed by people who are housed. It's like this constant forest without trees, right? And so if we're looking at people who are unhoused, and it's like, what's going on with you? It's important to kind of have that zoom out moment of like, what else might be happening for this person? What might else be happening behind the scenes that we're not seeing as someone who doesn't live that? Yeah. And just because I think it's important to end on like a positive kind of spin to trauma. And then I promise we'll get into some of maybe more concrete things of how we like navigate some of this. If we know that this is what people experience, how do we then work with people, even in small interactions? I do want to just name around trauma specifically that like just as
Quiero
trauma
nombrar sobre trauma específico.
in the context of relationships and systems, like healing also has to happen through relationships and needs to involve systems. And so part of that means that like having positive, healthy, healing relationships can be something that like genuinely helps to like heal trauma for people. Like sometimes it's just like having those people who will like slow down and like not respond in like height crisis when a client is responding in height crisis, or someone who's unhoused is responding in height crisis, and just being like a safe person. Obviously there's so much space here also for like referrals to ongoing therapy and medication, like all of those things are important. And that like when we think about moving towards healing, it happens in the context of relationship with other people and community, and the way that we are building like better community resources. And what this means is because it involves community, it's not just service providers, it's kind of on like everyone to just show up a little bit kinder and maybe a little bit more patient for people who are in these sort of situations. Yeah. So that was some pretty heavy stuff. And so I definitely want to pause and see what questions have come up during that, knowing it's scraping the surface. Like there's so much more that could be talked about around this. But that's just meant to be like a really brief kind of scraping the surface moment. Okay. So the person who asked the question, I would love to circle back to that maybe at the end. Because yeah, we definitely can talk about that for sure. Yeah, let's leave some space to talk about it at the end, because I think that's a really valid question. Okay. And feel free to pop any other questions into the chat that have come up, but I see you, person that posted it, and we'll chat at the end. Okay. I do want to get into some of like just concrete, like maybe if you are, especially I know the context of this is y'all are garden leaders and potentially have interactions with people who are unhoused that might like potentially like wander into the space that you're helping to care for, or like do things that might feel disrespectful to the spaces that you're in. I also think this is applicable just like as we're going about our lives too. Like, so that's also, hopefully there's like a little bit of takeaway there. But I do think it's really important to think about boundaries that we're setting, so that we are creating spaces that are safe, not only for other people, but like for ourselves as well. And yeah, so we're going to dive in a little bit to some boundaries. So I am kind of obsessed with this way of thinking about boundaries. This is Prentice Temple. They are like somatic activists, which just means they somatic is just a fancy word for like embodiment, kind of, or paying attention to your body. And so talking about how some like activism work and healing work can happen in our bodies. And they also have a podcast, cool person. But they like to say that the boundaries are the distance at which I can love both me and you simultaneously. And so, yeah, I think what's really important here is there is a space in which we can care for ourselves and care for other people. And if we are crossing that space and just trying to like care so much for the people around us or the people we're interacting with, there might be some ways in which we are no longer caring for ourselves. We're no longer showing up for ourselves. I think vice versa, there can be a way in which we're so focused on caring for our own well-being that we don't spend a lot of time caring about people around us. And so I love the idea of living in a space in which like our needs are still cared for. We're not letting people walk all over us. We're not letting people be aggressive or mean to us. Like that is also important. And so I just think it's important to kind of start with that framework. But I want to talk about a few different types of boundaries, like social boundaries, physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, some behavioral boundaries, and like technological boundaries. And this is just a gif of Harry Potter because I don't know that Hagrid and Harry had great boundaries, and that is, I'm just going to leave that there for anyone who cares. And so the first one is social. So if you are interacting with someone who's unhoused, and once again, especially in the context of like, maybe you're helping to care for this like beautiful community space, I think the first piece of like boundary advice I'd give is like, just know your role, like what role, and this is something that y'all can think about individually or collectively, like, what do you want that role to look like? And what that means is like determining kind of like, are we there to give out resources? Are we there to like invite people into the space? Are, you know, do we want to have like food on hand to give people, like whatever the role is? For context, like at Urban Peak, we say like, we are here to play a professional role. We're not here to be friends with people. We're not going to ever give someone our phone number. We're here to be professionals in this person's life. And that is like a beautiful sacred role that we get to play that not a lot of other people get to play. But what it means is that like, that's our sphere, that's our space. And so I do think it's important to name, especially maybe in the context of y'all as volunteers, like what role, what does that role look like? And what might be some like boundaries that come with that in terms of like limiting your interaction times. I think the next bullet point I have is just determining like the length and type of interactions you're going to have. So maybe you're not sitting for an hour and a half with someone to process their trauma. I would say that's probably the role for like a therapist, an outreach worker potentially that could sit and do something like that, but that's probably not the role that you're there to play in that person's life. So especially when I talk to people who are not in the sort of work that I'm in, I'm like, yeah, 5-10 minutes, maybe like hear how their day's going, offer some really basic forms of support. Like, hey, I heard there's a food pantry down the street. Do you want me to get you directions to get there? Like something that's just like tangible, quick, but you're not there to be someone's therapist. You're not there to be someone's family member. You're not there to be someone's best friend. It's kind of like, what's the role that I'm here to play? But how can I do it well and be kind and compassionate within like the role that I'm here to play right now? Physical boundaries, I think like it's incredibly important to establish and respect personal space, and know your own boundaries, potentially ask what other people's boundaries are. So what I mean by this, I have encountered my fair share of people who I maybe talk to for 5 or 10 minutes while I'm on the streets, just like maybe I'm walking to a coffee shop, someone stops me and is like, hey, can I use your cell phone? That's a physical boundary. And for me, I've decided I'm okay with someone using my cell phone, but it has to be under 3 minutes. Like I've kind of I've had enough of these interactions that I literally kind of have that line for myself. Yeah, you can use my cell phone, it has to be under 3 minutes. There was a time that after that happened, someone was like, can I give you a hug? And I'm like, you know what? I'm good. I don't I'm okay. Thank you though. Thanks so much for asking. But I don't really want to hug right now. That's me knowing my own boundaries. If you are someone that's really affectionate and you're like, we just had this great interaction, I want to hug this person. Like, if that's your vibe, like I'm not here to like hate on that, but also make sure you're asking other people's boundaries. Like they might not want to be hugged. And so especially around like, once again, physical boundaries, like, are you willing to share belongings? Are you willing to lend someone your cell phone? Are like all those sort of things, I think, I really do think depends on the person and like your willingness to provide those things, but also like respect, knowing that the other person also has like autonomy and could easily like not want that interaction at all. So I think it's just really important to like pay attention to your personal space. So emotional boundaries, I think it's super important to process after having interactions, especially if they are heavy interactions. So they're, for me, and I'm just going to share this as someone who, like, once again, I know I work in this field, but I also live in Denver. And so I constantly am interacting with people who are unhoused, who I don't know. And there have been some times where I've had interactions with people that like wear on my heart, where it's like someone is like going through it and really struggling. It is really important for me to like process that somehow, so I'm not just carrying it with me. And carrying it with me in like an unhealthy way. And so whatever that looks like for you, if you have like a friend or a colleague or like someone that you're like, can I just talk with you about this for like 5-10 minutes so that I'm not just like bringing this energy with me for the rest of my day. That is an emotional boundary. Like that is what that is. And it can be really healthy and important to do that, especially if you're someone that tends to be a bleeding heart in some way like I am. Awareness of personal bias and privilege, I think that is especially a boundary around like how our power shows up. And that's a hard boundary to set because it means being aware of kind of like, I am housed, I have good mental health, I have plenty of clean clothes, I am like in these situations where I have a lot of power. And having an awareness of your personal bias is setting a boundary around that power. And saying like, I'm still going to show up with compassion and not assume the worst in this person. And just because they're different than me doesn't mean that they're not valuable and worthy of caring for. I know that sounds like a weird kind of boundary, but it really is like kind of an emotional boundary around like how your identity shows up in some of these spaces. And then lead with dignity and respect. Once again, because it can be really easy for our own bias and our own worldview to be the leading factor. I think it's a really intentional and kind of scary process to dismantle that, and to show up with like dignity and respect and like assuming the best in somebody, even if there's someone that like looks different than you or acts different than you. Leading with that dignity and respect is it's really important in those spaces. I did want to share a little bit about like some technological boundaries. I tend to think that it's pretty disrespectful sometimes to post like a photo of a specific person who's unhoused, like without their permission, or for no purpose. Like that's someone's life, that's their story. So I just wanted to say that if you like have regular interactions with someone, I think like maybe like asking permission was like especially if they're not a good friend of yours, there can be some sort of boundaries around how you engage with social media around like experiences that you have with people who are unhoused. And people don't often like think through that. So I just wanted to just quickly mention that. And also like, I would be really cautious to share personal cell phone or email. I have accidentally done that before to not a client, but someone I like met who was on the streets and they like bombarded my cell phone, and that will not happen all the time. That is not to say that it will always happen, but just be really mindful. Just because someone asks for it doesn't mean you have to do it. And so just really want to name that like that there's space for personal boundaries around like whatever you decide about that. And then behavioral boundaries. So this is what we're going to really talk about next and like spend a little bit more time talking about. But like responding to harmful behaviors means you're drawing a boundary around like this way of acting is not appropriate. This is like actively aggressive or actively harmful, drawing a line there. that is hard to do sometimes, especially if someone is really like chaotic or in really high crisis. So the next thing is also knowing when to tap out. Knowing when like, hey, this is actually no longer within my role. This is no longer like within the territory of what I can do or help out with. So know when to tap out. If it's an emergency, 911 is honestly the fastest and best option. I have a lot of hesitancy towards calling the police for people who are unhoused because there tends to be a lot of tension there. And that's all I'll say about that. But there are so many other resources that you can tap into. So if it's not actually an emergency, I would encourage maybe looking up the number for STAR, which will dispatch like social workers and paramedics without sending police with them. There's also a mobile crisis line that in certain situations they'll send a therapist to work with someone, but those are both slower response times. And so I think I just kind of wanted to name that the emergency response is like, it is still calling 911. That's the option that exists. If it's not emergent and you don't really kind of know what that person needs, you can call 311, which that will dispatch the city's outreach team. And once again, that's not going to be like a day of response most of the time, but that is like awesome people who are really well trained and will go like to different parts of the city just to interact with people who are unhoused and help connect them to resources. So like really helpful resource to know about is just calling 311. Because if there's a situation where there's harmful behavior, or you feel unsafe, or you feel like this is not a situation that I want to be in, like tap out. That's a form of boundary setting of saying like, this is not a space that I should be in or be interacting in. And once again, in those moments, there are other community resources to kind of step in and fill some of that gap. So that's mostly what I wanted to say around boundaries. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to actually interact with someone in crisis. And we have about 30 minutes to do that. But I also, like, this is just the end of the penultimate section. And so I wanted to see, I know that was like pretty broad to boundaries because I'm obviously not working in your spaces. But if there are questions, feel free to type them. I already saw a couple pop up. Okay, yeah. Okay, so first of all, okay, I think Denver Urban Gardens is responding to Jeanette. And Diana, yeah, let's talk about that for a second. So the question, and I don't know if other people can see it, the question is that the community garden that Diana works in and others in the area are experiencing high degrees of vandalism. There have been multiple fires that have burned down sheds, litter, etc. Some of which we know and or assume are caused by unhoused folks. We don't know what we can do to be friendly and protect our gardens that we've worked so hard to build. Are there specific ideas? Yeah, so I can try to come up with specific ideas. The one thing I actually want to name that feels just important to share is that like the building that I work in downtown, where we are so intentional about serving people directly and provide like the safe space for like hundreds of youth, like also has regularly been vandalized. I've had windows broken. There have been fires. There's been literal dumpster fires within the past few months outside of our building. So I want to just mostly say that to say that like there's not an easy solution, I don't think, to that. And I hate to say that, but I really do think that like I also don't know why. I think there's a lot of anger and a lot of emotion that circulates in a lot of people in our community that don't feel like they have a place or feel really like cut off from broader community or from society. And I think that manifests in a lot of different ways. And specifically, I'll just share it in our space of what we have done. I mean, we have security cameras. That has been a really important thing for us. It means that we can have a little bit of like increased accountability for people who are consistently doing things to harm our space. I was not a fan of that at first, but it has actually kind of helped to deter some of that longer term. We work really hard to hold personal people accountable. So like actual individuals who we know of, it's a conversation around like, why don't you feel respected? What can we do to respect you more? What can you do to show us a little bit of respect, and like how can we make you feel welcome here, and like literally have those conversations with people. But part of that is because we're able to see them on our security cameras, and so I feel bad that it's not even like a super specific thing. It's more of like digging behind the surface, and like I wonder how we can maybe welcome those people into spaces. And the other thing I maybe want to say is that like maybe just to be cautious that like that those few people that are doing that, which that is like so shitty, and also is not representative of like everyone who's unhoused, right? Which I know you're not saying, but I think it can be a really slippery slope to say like it is like homeless people who are like destroying our property. It is probably like a select few of like 3-4 people, and it's not like every unhoused person in the area. And I know you're not saying that, but I just kind of want to name that because it can be easy to kind of take like actions of a couple people and like kind of have that shade the way we view everyone. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I guess that's a couple of like initial responses to that, and I know that's not gonna solve that problem, but I also can think about other ideas. The other thing I didn't want to mention is around litter. I think making sure there's like plenty of trash cans in the area, and honestly that's a solution I have to people pooping too. If that's happening, is like make sure there's lots of porta potties, which I don't know, like I personally have gotten on 311, Denver's 311 response system. There's an online format that you can fill out, and I've been like there's poop here, we need a porta potty, and I don't know that they always respond the way I want them to, but it's like advocating for those things more consistently. Like we need more trash cans in this park because like there's litter everywhere, is really making sure that people have access to those things as like a foundational way of addressing the problem, I think. But I appreciate the question, and I'll keep thinking on it and let you know if I come up with anything. Okay, and I just saw one other question. Okay, yeah, let's talk about this. So most of the gardeners in the area are non-English speakers and sometimes bring their children in the garden. So how do we approach the unhoused people who do inappropriate activities with children around? Yeah, so that is something where I would suggest really direct confrontation. If you're comfortable, and if not, I would suggest a 311 call or a 911 call, especially if children are involved, because it, I think, absolutely needs to be a safe place for those people. So that's what I would suggest is, I know I have a perspective where I'm someone who's really regularly interacted with people who are unhoused, so I know I'm a lot more confident in that. But I would like approach someone and say, hey, you know what, there's kids around, like, can I please ask you not to do that? And if they're disrespectful or like start yelling or anything like that, I think once again, I always keep in mind that trauma brain. It's like, okay, they're not actually mad about me, their brain is trauma mode. Like they're not mad at me necessarily, but I'm going to disengage and call 911 because this is like not my space. Which yeah, I think like directly asking people, and I will be super honest, what I've found from working with people who are unhoused is that when I'm like, hey, there's like a kiddo right here, can we please like stop what's happening right now? I like, there have been so many times where as soon as you're like, hey, there's kids here, people are like, I'm so sorry, like I want to be respectful to kids. And just like I think people might surprise you of being receptive to that feedback and saying like, you're right, like that's not okay. So yeah, I mean, to the extent that you or that someone else feels like safe directly asking someone not to do that, especially if there's like active things happening, if it's like in the moment, I think people might surprise you in how they respond kindly. And if it becomes unsafe, I think that's a moment where you disengage and call someone else to work with that. For the sake of time, thank you for your questions, and we can have more time at the end if it's helpful. I want to quickly just talk about how to work with someone if they're like in crisis. And honestly, Jeanette, that might also help. It potentially could help answer your question too, like how do you have those direct conversations and what does that look like? So I want to make sure I get to some of that material. So here's what it looks like when someone's escalated, and we're only going to focus on the first few. So when someone is like becoming escalated, which means like they're kind of getting angry, they're getting maybe violent, it doesn't happen all at once often. It usually is kind of different things happening for people at different stages. So the first thing I want to talk about is when someone is at like baseline behavior. Our response as people kind of working with those folks is going to be to focus on like how we can engage in healing. So baseline this is what it means when someone just like their day-to-day behavior, like it's kind of their average way of existing in the world. Every single person in the world is going to have a different baseline behavior, a different way of showing up in the world on a regular basis. And so the best way to work with someone is just like form a relationship with them. That doesn't have to mean you're like their best friend. It's just like get to know like, oh, this person who always hangs out by this garden is like they're always a little bit like they're pacing around, but so far they've never done anything aggressive. So like maybe they just kind of pace around on a regular basis. Like good to know. Because sometimes people can be like really like fun going and kind. Also, people could be really isolated or quiet. Also, sometimes people can be really loud and introspective, or like loud and confrontational. But as soon as we start generalizing a behavior as violent or as threatening, it can't, not always, but it can be rooted in bias. One example that I have is there was a young man who would constantly just pace around our space, constantly was talking to himself, like always talking to something that wasn't there and pacing. He literally never, ever once got in a fight. He was never yelled at someone. He was never disrespectful towards staff, but on a daily basis, he was just kind of pacing around talking to himself. And if we were to have generalized that behavior as threatening or violent, that would have actually kind of been bias against his mental health, because it turns out he has mental health problems. He sees things that aren't there, but he was never violent once. And so I just kind of want to name that, like, as soon as we kind of start generalizing certain behaviors as violent, that it actually can be kind of rooted in like bias against maybe certain mental health problems or certain races of people, certain genders, stuff like that. So just like kind of wanting to name that. And when people are in that kind of regulated space, or however they normally show up in the world, that's when we have opportunities for doing like growth and healing centered work. So this could be an awesome chance to maybe like if someone who was like regularly hanging out in the park by where you garden or something is like, they're like in a great mood, they're like happy to be around, like, hey, like, have you checked out like the food pantry down the street? I've heard it's really good. Or like, just like, hey, how's your day going? Like, cool. It was awesome to meet you. See you later. Like, not like, I'm not saying like, 20-minute conversations, but like actually just like kind of spending some time getting to know someone. And what that means is that like when those crises happen, like maybe they kind of recognize you or trust you a little bit. And that doesn't mean, that you need to feel obligated to do this with everyone in your life, but it just can be like, if someone is just kind of like, they don't seem like they're in high crisis, they're not yelling at anything, they're just kind of hanging out saying like, hey, how's your day going? And just like having a 2-minute conversation can actually go such a long way in terms of like that person not then like they might be less prone to disrespect your space. They might be less prone to like do something inappropriate or aggressive later, because they like recognize you and have built just like a little bit of like understanding of who you are and why you're there. So once again, I'm not suggesting like 20-minute conversations. I'm just like a quick little 30-second, like, hey, like, are you having a good day enjoying the sunshine? Like really basic stuff like that. I want to also just name that like I work in a building downtown where all of the camps around our building are people I don't know. It's not like our clients, it's like people who are adults who are unhoused, who I've never known ever. And for a while, they were like all crowded in front of our front door. And every time I would try to get my bike in the door, they're like kind of like not happy that I'm there. But I've like talked with them enough and been like, oh, hey, like, how's your day going? Or like, or did you stay safe in the rain last night? Just like really basic things that like I now have experiences with like the same people who would be like so angry that I was coming in the front door and had to ask them to move. Those same people are now like opening the door for me, like, hey, get your bike in. Like, thank you so much. And I really want to be careful to not like generalize, like if you're kind to people, like they'll never graffiti your building or like it will always go well. Cause also I know as well as anyone else that like that is not always like a good thing to suggest for everyone, but just like really basic interactions with someone who's unhoused is just like, I think it does go a long way for creating like community respect. And if you're interacting with someone and they seem like they are destabilized, which means anything that is a little bit shifted from their baseline behavior, we're going to have a totally different response. So this is when someone is perceiving a threat and feels unsafe. This also I just want to name, it's not quite where someone's escalated, but maybe they're like a little bit uncertain or afraid. The focus that I suggest in these moments is just to like focus on just like providing whatever little support that you can to the person. I always like to encourage people to maybe know at least one service within walking distance of your space. There's a bunch of different types of services all over Denver, but if you know of at least one that you can say like, hey, you know, like, I know that this day center is open right now. Have you thought about going over there? Could just give someone a way to connect to a service provider who might be more equipped to support them. I also try the good old redirection technique sometimes, where I'm just like trying to shift my attention to something else, or like help shift the person's attention to something else. And sometimes that is all someone needs. It's just like a different thing to focus on. And sometimes just like active listening helps, especially like if you have capacity, or that's often what you would see a service provider doing, is just kind of saying like, do you want to talk about what's going on? Because it seems like you're kind of angry right now. And literally just giving people like 3 minutes to say what's going on for them. I would never suggest for anyone who's like outside of like social work profession to try to have like a 30-minute conversation really getting into what's going on. But you like, if you could provide like a minute or two, that sometimes can go a long way. If someone seems like they're upset, but they're not actively like yelling or violent, this like just having a little space to like tell someone how they're feeling can go a long way. And the idea is that like, if we practice just like that soothing kind of response, we can kind of avoid the rest of the escalation altogether. But if someone is at the place where they're like fully just escalated and in a bad space, I would suggest that we once again kind of shift the focus that we have, and I'll explain what that is in a second. So this is escalation. So this is when a person is beginning to defend themselves against a threat. And I like this language of defending because it's typically not that someone is trying to be aggressive. It's like someone is perceiving some kind of a threat, whether it's like, I mean, it could kind of be anything, but whether it's related to like their personal trauma or something that's like happening around them. And that person's getting kind of defensive and their trauma brain is kind of rapid firing, right? So this is when that person is just not able to regulate. I'd like to say that this is not yet to the point of physical harm. What we're talking about, this is maybe someone's like yelling. When it gets to the point of physical harm, I would say disengage. Like if someone is actively like punching or throwing something, like not ever anyone's role to deal with. But if someone just kind of in a really bad space, here's what I suggest doing. This is what we teach our staff, honestly. So like you're learning stuff that our staff do all the time, which is just so simple. And that's why I really love it, is if someone is in a high stress space, we just say feelings, limits, options. And I'll explain what that means. So feelings is just acknowledging what the person's feeling and expressing empathy. So this is really like a quick one-liner, like, whoa, I totally hear that you're angry. Like, that is super valid, or like, that sounds so hard. Just like a one-line thing. And try to avoid language that's like, I know how you feel, because you probably don't know exactly how they feel. And that I've seen that like totally trigger people. And the goal here is maybe like, don't ask questions. If someone's actively yelling, it's not like, hey, how are you today? It's like, hey, like, whoa, it seems like you're pretty angry. And like, or it seems like there's a lot going on for you right now. Just like a one-liner to express some empathy. And the reason why I say don't ask questions is because at this point, if you're asking questions, they probably will just continue to yell. It doesn't make a ton of sense to ask someone who's yelling like an open-ended question, because it's just kind of a license for them to keep yelling, in my experience. And then we set a limit. So immediately after we acknowledge the feelings, we set a boundary. So like, the boundaries focus on the behavior, not about the person. And we want to avoid any like language that is shaming or blaming the person. But so for example, it could be like, hey, like, I can tell that like there's a lot going on for you today, but this is a space that there's a lot of kiddos in, and like, we would really appreciate like some space right now. It's just something about like, hey, like, I can tell there's a lot going on, but like, it's really important for us to make sure that this is a space that feels safe to kids. Something like that, right? Where we're setting a boundary around whatever's happening. And a question just to ask ourselves are like, is there a way to communicate whatever these boundaries or limits are before the crisis happens? And could that be like signs of like, hey, like, this is like a community friendly space, like, please don't use drugs here, like, you know, please like respect this space by finding a different bathroom, like, just like, how are we like communicating that? I don't know that will always help, I'm going to be super honest, but I think if we're proactive about that, it can, I do think it is better than nothing. And then giving an option, because most people don't respond super well to a directive. So we're like naming the feeling, setting a limit, and then giving someone some kind of an option that restores some power back to them. So what I would always say in my work is like, okay, so like, especially if someone was in our day center and was being threatening or violent in some way, it would be a lot of just like, hey, like, I hear that you're super angry, but like, this is a space where like yelling like this much is like really not okay for the rest of the community. So you can leave this building on your own, or we can go to my office and talk right now. Like, which one would you rather do? Either way, that person's leaving the space, right? That's the trick. It's like, either way, like, we're good with what happens. When it's a situation where it feels really out of control, the option you give is you say like, hey, like, you can definitely just like walk away, but like, if you're not able to do that, I'm going to call the police. And like, those are kind of the two options on the table. Like, this is feeling unsafe for some of the kids here, like, you know, you can leave and I won't do anything, or I'm like gonna have to call the police because it's feeling unsafe right now. And it's, so you're just kind of like setting, you're giving an option, which just means that person like has a little bit of a choice. And it tends to be that person will calm down a little bit because they have to kind of re-engage with that logical part of the brain. So it's also sort of a trick, because like, you can't really respond to something without like engaging the part of your brain that thinks through information. So it actually kind of forces people to calm down and sift through info. Just wanted to quickly name that like, intentional communication, super important. So being able to give like short and simple messages, be kind and warmth in your voice if at all possible, give people personal space. Try to not have like a threatening body posture where you're standing over someone. Like, if you can just kind of be a little bit relaxed, like, it goes a long way with people to not feel threatened. Make eye contact if you feel comfortable doing that. So some of those communication styles is really important. And then the last thing I want to land on is like rational detachment, which is just this concept of like knowing it's not about you. If someone is really angry or responds aggressively, even those reactions that are targeted, if they're targeted towards you, are rarely actually about you. Because as we talked about, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on for people and a whole lot of trauma going on behind the scenes. And so, yeah, so this is a space where maybe we also can check ourselves, like, can I walk away right now? Am I getting into like an argument with this person? If you sense yourself getting into an argument, we call that a power struggle. You can walk away. And I think that's the beauty of, you know, knowing your own boundaries and knowing like, hey, this is when this crosses a line, I'm going to leave. Totally within your power to do that. If all of that fails, if all of that stuff we just talked about is like not working, disengage, like just walk away. Like, can you leave and come back later? If you can't, call 911. If this is like, I like cannot leave right now, but it's like, I think disengaging rather than trying to like continue to like get into an argument with someone, it usually solves the problem a lot faster than anything else. So if you can leave and come back later, if someone's getting really, really upset, I would like recommend trying to do that. You don't owe anybody staying in a conversation that's disrespectful. I say just like, hey, I actually have to leave now. See you around. Like, hey, this is actually feeling disrespectful to me. I gotta go. And just walk away. And that is a really powerful tool that we have in our tool belt. And once again, just wanted to have this on here one more time, is you can call 311 for outreach dispatch, and you can call 911 if the situation is actively unsafe. And in every crisis, I really like the fallback language of like having compassion over comprehension. I don't have to know why someone's upset in order to be compassionate towards them. And so kind of knowing that like you don't have to understand what's going on in someone's life or like why they're angry or why they're having a bad day in order to show some compassion. So cool. That is it for me. That's my email address. You can reach out if there are like other big questions. And I wanted to circle back really quickly, and any other questions you can type in the chat. I'm going to take a hot second to read this one that came up. Yeah, so there's this question is like, why don't people go to shelters? And why aren't more people having jobs? And yeah, a huge piece of this. I kind of mentioned the shelter thing. There's a lot of barriers around shelters that I named that was just around like it not being a super safe space for people who are like partnered or have a pet or a transgender or women. There's very few beds for people who are women, families, or migrants. But I also want to name that shelters can be really violent also. I had a youth, I feel weird sharing this a little bit, but I had a client who like literally was stabbed to death. He was like a 19-year-old kid. He actually was like working a job. He like had a lot together in his life, staying at a shelter, and was stabbed by a random resident. And once again, it's hard because I don't want to like shame that person. I don't know what that person had going on. But like it's just tight, close little quarters, and it can be really violent. And the staff do their absolute best, but I know it doesn't always feel safe for people. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is I do think there's a lot of barriers that are often not named around employment too, where it's things like literally you have to have vital documents almost everywhere. Like, and people who are unhoused often like either don't have their vital documents or you have to pay to get new ones. Have never had them before, don't have a place to store them, they got stolen. Like there's so many things. Having a phone number or a computer to even like apply for jobs and follow up on job applications. So it's actually like having clean clothes to wear to work every day. There's actually like so many barriers around like how do you even keep a job? And that said, I also know so many people who are working. Like there are so many people who are unhoused and are working, and so many people who are unhoused and are like actively trying to save up money for an apartment. So I do think there are a couple layers here where one is that like, it's really hard. And the second is people do it. And I think those people often go unseen or unnoticed, but that's true. And yeah, there's a lot, especially around, I think you mentioned like maybe someone who's bipolar or someone who's an alcoholic. Treatment is really important. And it is next to impossible to get someone into treatment in my experience who doesn't have health insurance and doesn't have any family money or family who will help them navigate it. I've tried to help countless clients get into treatment, and countless countless clients like who came up to me and were like, can I please, will you help me get treatment? And yeah, I wasn't able to find a space that would take them. And so it's actually a lot more complex. Like the resources that exist are pretty hard to navigate is part of it. So yeah, so I think that maybe is some of the answer. And maybe the last thing that I want to share is maybe responding to the comment that just like kind of getting on with life instead of wallowing in whatever trauma you're feeling, and kind of responding to that. The thing about trauma is it's not just a feeling. It often really impacts the way our brains are wired and the way we can respond to stress. And so if people have experienced a lot of trauma, they actually are not going to be able to show up in most spaces in a way that is acceptable, and actually are going to have to do a lot of work around like processing that trauma, relearning how to like pause before they just instinctively respond to something that's stressful. There are a lot of things that work there: mindfulness, breathing exercises, trauma therapy. Like there's a lot that can be done, EMDR specifically, that is so helpful for people who are living with trauma. But it is, yeah, it's often a lot more complex than just kind of getting over it or like not wallowing in it. It's a lot of processing that has to happen to heal. So that's kind of a disjointed answer, but I hope that kind of answered some of it. It's also like it's 7:30. So if there are other questions that are popping up, I would love to help answer any of those.
Nico, I'm gonna chime in from the ether. I'm sorry that the chat and Q&A thing is a little funky because it's a webinar, but I just had a quick question, and I know you are based in Denver, and you mentioned a few Denver-specific resources and 311. I know we have a couple folks on the call who are based in Gardens in Aurora. I'm just wondering if you have any, I don't know, partner organizations you've done stuff with, or any Aurora-specific stuff. I know it's sort of out of your zone, but or if they have a non-emergency number, I would imagine.
I would imagine they have a 311. I know that they're starting to form a city outreach team like the one we have. I don't think it's formed quite yet, but I actually know the person who's starting to oversee it. So that will come soon. And there are outreach workers in Aurora though, like that totally exists. The Aurora Day Resource Center is like a place that I've referred a lot of people to. Big space with a ton of resources. And I believe they actually like have an outreach team that they dispatch to respond to things as well. So, and Comitis is the shelter out there, I believe. And the mental health center in Aurora, I know, also has like day centers that work with people who are unhoused and really accessible mental health resources too. And I'm spacing on the exact name of it, but the mental health resources in Aurora, from what I've heard, are pretty accessible to people as well. And I believe there's an outreach team tied to their resources too. So I can get you more concrete info, but I'm obviously not like quite as up to speed with Aurora resources, but the ones that I know of, I can send to you.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. And if there's, I mean, yeah, it's 7:31, so I just want to be respectful of time, and that's all the info I had. But please, like, you can reach out to me over email, and like Denver Urban Gardens folks can like just forward this PowerPoint in case it's ever helpful to refer back to. All I got.